stone tile cemented in front of the samadhi of Rupa Goswami. The room was furnished with a small, low desk, a kusha mat, and a wooden cot with a rope-woven surface to lie on. The view was not the panorama he had enjoyed at Keshigat, and the neighbourhood was not so secluded. But now, without even moving from his room, he could look into the temple and see a portion of the altar and the 4-foot-high form of Vrindavan Chandra, the black marble Krishna deity Krishnadas Kaviraj had worshipped hundreds of years ago. The main room was connected to the kitchen by a 10-foot-long veranda which faced the courtyard, and from his kitchen he could see the samadhi of Rupa Goswami. So the place was superior to his room at the Vamsi Gopalaji temple, because now he was living in the temple of Jiva Goswami, where great souls like the Goswamis Rupa, Sanatan, Raghunath, and Jiva had all gathered, taken prasadam, chanted, and discussed Krishna and Lord Chaitanya to work on Srimad Bhagavatam. At 1 a.m., when no one else was up and it, Bhaktivedanta Swami would wake and begin writing. Since electric failures were not uncommon in Vrindavan, he would often work by lantern light. But in any case, a beam of light would shine out from his room onto the veranda. In the room he worked under its brightness. While he wrote in stillness, sometimes a toad as dry as the stone floor would hop out of hiding and across the floor, exiting through the cement latticework of the opposite wall. Sometimes a tiny mouse would run out from behind a window shutter and hide in another place. Otherwise, the room was complete sanctified stillness, and the inspiration of being in the presence of the 6 Goswami. Above the open courtyard, sky would be full of clearly visible stars. As he worked, the only sounds would come from the town, perhaps of a dog barking in the distance.
At 4 a.m., the temple pujari, who slept under a shelter near the deity doors, would awake, turn on an electric light, and with a long pole, clear the bats from the rafters. At 5 a.m., after waking the deities, the pujari would open the doors before the altar and begin Mangalarti. He would offer a flame while a few resident devotees gathered and chanted, playing instruments. Usually someone would bang a gong while someone else rang a large bell. Any sound from the courtyard carried immediately to Bhaktivedanta Swami's quarters, and the changing bell and gong would suddenly reverberate against the walls of his small room. From his sitting place on the left of the altar, sometimes he would pause at his walk and walk into the courtyard to see the deities and their arati. The altar was filled with deities of Radha and Krishna who had been worshipped by Jiva Goswami and other Vaishnava acharyas hundreds of years ago. After 10 minutes, the pujari, having offered the flame and then a conch shell filled with water, would turn and sprinkle offered water on the heads of the devotees, and the ceremony would end. Working a few hours on Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhaktivedanta Swami would sit in his room and chant japa. As the morning sky turned light blue, the stars would vanish, and residents of Vrindavan would arrive to visit the deities and the samadhis of the Goswamis. Old women would enter the temple calling out Jai Radhe in broken voices. When Bhaktivedanta Swami opened the shutters, his room would fill with light. His windows were not so much windows as cement latticework in the wall. Although passers-by could not easily see into the room, the latticework allowed light to enter. In the morning light, the room was clearly revealed. The arched ceiling, the freshly painted walls with arched niches, the floor of inlaid stone. Bhaktivedanta Swami's thin sannyas apron, khadi, leaned against one corner of the room. On one shelf he had placed a picture of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. On another, a stack of books. The room's 2 doors appeared flimsy even when locked, and the whole room tilted slightly to the left. It was bare but peaceful. Often sitting on the veranda between the two rooms, he would view the courtyard, the altar, and the deities Radha Damodar, Vrindavan Chandra, and several other Radha Krishna deities awaited their visitors. During the morning, the deity doors remained open as a regular file of visitors turned the temple into a bustling place of pilgrimage. No one stayed very long. Some had rigid schedules to visit many temples and hurry, and also local businessmen, their wives in colorful saris. All devotees headed towards the altar, calling Jai Ho, Jai Radhe. After greeting the deities, they would disappear through the door to the outdoor area of the temple compound to visit the samadhis. Someone else?
Okay.
Yes, please.
Also in Vrindavana, there were hundreds of small temple-like tombs following paths. Vaishnavas or Charyas, Bhaktivedanta Swami regularly visited the chief samadhis. Those of Sri Jiva Goswami, Srila Bhaktivedanta Saraswati, and Srila Krishnadasa Kaviraj Goswami. Within a separate area of the temple compound were the Vajanas, Kirtanara, and the Samadhi of Rupa Goswami. Bhaktivedanta Swami often sat chanting japas before Rupa Goswami Samadhi. The line of pilgrims from the temple would continue entering the outdoor area of the compound, coming to offer dandavat to Rupa Goswami. Most pilgrims considered this the most important to Radha Damodara temple. And even if they offered respect now where else, they would stop before the Samadhi of Rupa Goswami. They would stop with folded hand and bow, chanting japas, chanting Jaya Radha, or with their hand in their beads bag, chant Hare Krishna mantras, circumambulating the Samadhis. Bhaktivedanta Swami would sit and chant even of the early morning rush of visitors, or walk to the nearby temple of Radha Shyamasundara or Radha Mandana Mohana, always returning by 11 to cook. As he cooked and later as he sat to take his prasadam, he would see through the lattice work the Samadhi of Rupa Goswami. Feeling Rupa Goswami's presence, he would think of his own mission for his spiritual master. The devotees of the Lord Chaitanya are known as Rupanugas, Rupa Goswami. Without following the teaching and example of Rupa Goswami, one cannot enter the path of pure devotional to Radha and Krishna. Srila Bhaktivedanta Saraswati was especially known as a strict Rupanuga, as described in the Sanskrit prayer written in his honor. I offer my respectful obeisances unto Sri Bhaktivedanta Saraswati, the personified energy of Sri Chaitanya Mercy, who delivers devotional service enriched with conjugal love of Radha and Krishna, coming exactly in the line of Swami. I offer my respectful obeisances unto you, who are the personified teaching of Lord Chaitanya. You are the deliverers of the fallen soul. You do not tolerate any statement that is against the teaching of devotional service initiated by Srila Rupa Goswami. Next. Somebody else? Vibhor.
Rumi, would anyone else?
Maybe you read Lalita.
Okay. Bhaktivedanta Swami's spiritual master and the previous spiritual succession had wanted the Krishna consciousness movement to spread all over the world, and as Bhaktivedanta Bhaktivedanta Swami daily gathered inspiration. Sitting before Rupa Goswami's samadhi, he prayed to his spiritual predecessors for guidance. The direction he received from them was an absolute dictation, and no government, no public shake or diminish it. Rupa Goswami wanted him to go to the west. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wanted him to go to the west. Krishna had arranged that he be brought to Radha Damodar temple to receive their blessings. At the Radha Damodar temple, he felt he had entered an eternal residence known only to the pure devotees of the Lord. Yet, although they were allowing him to associate intimately with them in the place of their pastimes, they were ordering him to leave Radha Damodar and Vrindavan, and to deliver the message of the acharyas to forgetful parts. In June, the weather became intolerably hot, and one could at the afternoon. During the most oppressive hours, Bhaktivedanta Swami would shut his doors and shutters and run the overhead fan. By evening, the heat would abate. Again, a flurry of visitors would arrive, and in the temple compound there would be evening kirtans. Sitting on his veranda, Bhaktivedanta Swami would sometimes talk with visitors, or sometimes they would come to his door and observe him as he was known in Vrindavan as a scholar and a sublime devotee. But he kept to himself as much as possible, especially in the summer of 1962, working on Srimad. That was his real purpose in coming here, to prepare the books he would distribute to the people of the West. Although as yet he had no means for traveling even as far as Japan, and no means for printing books, there were the goals for which he worked. These were the goals for which he worked. He had not come to Vrindavan. Rather, he had come because it was the ideal place to gain spiritual strength for his main life's work. The exact shape of his future mission, Bhaktivedanta Swami did not know, but he did know that he must prepare himself for preaching Srimad Bhagavatam to the English-speaking Western world. He must become a perfectly equipped instrument of his masters, and if they desired, they would send him.
However, I'll go ahead. In chapter 11, the dream come true. I planned that I must go to America, generally London, but I did not want to go to London. I was simply thinking how to go to New York. I was scheming whether I shall go this way through Tokyo, Japan, or that way. Which way is cheaper? That was my proposal, and I was targeting to New York always. Sometimes I was dreaming that I have come to New York, Srila Prabhupada. Writing was only half the battle. The other half was publishing. Both Bhaktivedanta Swami and his spiritual master wanted to see Srimad Bhagavatam printed in English and distributed widely. According to the teachings of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the most modern method of printing and distributing books should be used to spread Krishna consciousness. Although many books of Vaishnava wisdom had already been perfectly presented by Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, and Jiva Goswami, the manuscript now sat deteriorating in the Radha Damodara temple and other locations. And even the Gaudiya Math printing of the Goswamis' works were not being widely distributed. One of Bhaktivedanta Swami's god brother asked him why he was spending so much time and effort trying to make a new commentary on the Bhagavatam. Since so many great acharyas had already commented upon it, but in Bhaktivedanta Swami's mind there was no question. His spiritual master had given him an order. Commercial publishers, however, were not interested in the 60-volume Bhagavad. Bhaktivedanta Swami was not interested in anything less than a 60-volume presentation of verses, names, and purports based on the commentaries of the previous acharyas. But to publish such book, he would have to raise private donations and publish at his own expense. Radha Damodar temple may have been the best place for writing Srimad Bhagavatam, but not for printing and publishing it. For that, he would have to go to New Delhi. Among his Delhi contacts, Bhaktivedanta Swami considered Hitsaran Sharma a likely helper. Although when he had stayed in Mr. Sharma's home, Mr. Sharma had appreciated him more as a member of a job individual. At least Mr. Sharma was inclined to help sadhus, and he recognized Bhaktivedanta Swami as a genuinely religious person. Therefore, when Bhakti approached him in his office, he was willing to help, considering it a religious duty to propagate Srimad Bhagavatam. Hitsaran Sharma was qualified to help for two reasons. He was the secretary of J.D. Dalmia, a wealthy philanthropist, and he was the owner of a commercial printing work, Radha Press. According to Mr. Sharma, Mr. Dalmia would not directly give money to Bhaktivedanta Swami, even if his secretary suggested it. Mr. Sharma therefore advised Bhaktivedanta Swami to go to Gorakhpur and show his manuscript to Hanuman Prasad Podar. Accepting this as a good advice, Bhaktivedanta Swami journeyed to Gorakhpur, some 475 miles from Delhi. Even such a trip as this constituted a financial strain. Bhaktivedanta Swami's daily ledger showed a balance of 130 rupees as of August 8, 1962, the day he started for Gorakhpur. By the time he reached Lucknow, he was down to 57 rupees. Travel from Lucknow to Gorakhpur cost another 6 rupees, and the rickshaw to Mr. Podar's home cost 80 paisa. Would someone else like to read? I think there's Gurmukh Prabhu here.
Yes, Mataji, I will go ahead. Hare Krishna. But the trip was well worth the cost. Bhaktivedanta Swami presented Mr. Podkar with his letter of introduction from Hitsaran Sharma and then showed him his manuscript. After briefly examining the manuscript, Mr. Podar concluded it to be a highly developed work that should be supported. He agreed to send a donation of 4 to the Dalmia Trust in Delhi to be used towards the publication of Sri A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srimad Bhagavatam. Indian printers do not always require full payment before they begin a job, provided they receive a substantial advance payment after the job is printed and bound. A customer who has not made the complete payment takes a portion of books commensurate to what he has paid, and after selling those books, he uses his profit to buy more. Bhaktivedanta Swami estimated that printing one volume would cost 7,000 rupees, so he was 3,000 short. He raised a few hundred rupees more by going door to door throughout Delhi. Then he went back to Radha Press and asked Hitsaran Sharma to begin. Mr. Sharma agreed. Radha Press had already produced much of the first 2 chapters when Bhaktivedanta Swami objected that the type was not. He wanted 12-point type, but the Radha Press had only 10-point. So Mr. Sharma agreed to take the work to another printer, Mr. Gautam Sharma of OK Press. In printing one of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, OK Press printed 4 book pages twice on a side of one sheet of paper, 20 by 26 inches. But before running the full 1100 copies, they would print a proof, which Bhaktivedanta Swami would read. Then, following the corrected proofs, the printer would correct the handset a second proof, which Bhaktivedanta would also read. Usually, he would also find errors on the second proof. If so, they would print a third. If he found no errors on the third proof, they would then print the final pages. Vedanta Swami was able to order small quantities of paper as he could afford it, from 6 to 10 reams at a time, ordered 2 weeks in advance. Even as the volume was being printed, he was still writing the last chapter. When the proofs were ready at OK Press, he would pick up the proofs, return to his room, correct the proofs, and then return them. Sometimes 14-year-old Kantvedi, who lived at the Chipavada temple with his parents, would carry the proofs back and forth for the Swami. But in the last month of 1962, Bhaktivedanta Swami made a daily walk to OK Press. His walk through the tight, crowded lanes of Chipavada soon led him to a road close to the Jam, and that road led into the noisy, heavily trafficked Chawri Bazaar. The neighborhood was a busy paper district where laborers with ropes strapped across their shoulders pulled stout wooden carts, heavily loaded with stacks of paper on a small iron wheel. For 2 blocks, paper dealers were the only businesses. Hariram Gupta and Company, Roopchand and Sons, Bengal Paper Mill Company Limited, Universal Traders, Janta Paper Mart, one after another, even down the side alleys. The neighborhood storefronts were colorful and disorderly. Pedestrian traffic was so hectic that a person for a moment would cause a disruption. Carts and rickshaws carried paper and other forth through the streets. Sometimes a laborer would jog past with a hefty stack of pages on his head, the stack weighing down on either end. Traffic was swift, and an unmindful or slow-footed pedestrian being struck by a load protruding from the head of a bearer or from a passing cart. Occasionally, a man would be squatting on the roadside, smashing chunks of coal into small pieces to sell. Tiny corner smoke shops drew small gatherings of customers for cigarettes or pan. The shopkeepers would rapidly spread the pan spices on a betel leaf, and the customer would walk down the street chewing the pan and spitting out red stained saliva. Amidst this milieu, as the Chawri Bazar commercial district blended into tenement played in the hazardous streets, Bhaktivedanta Swami was a gentle looking yet determined figure. As he walked past the tenements, the tire, the grain seller, the sweet shops, and the overhead would be electric wires, pigeons, and the cloth lines from the tenement balconies. Finally, he would come to OK Press directly across from a small mosque. He would come carrying the corrected proofs to anxiously oversee the printing work. After 4 months, when I lost my connection, sorry, Mataji. After 4 months, when the whole book had been printed and the sheets were stacked on the floor of press, Mr. Hitsaran Sharma arranged for the work to be moved to a bindery. The binding was done by an ancient operation which took another month. Bhaktivedanta Swami would come and observe the workers sat in a small room surrounded by stacks of printed paper. The first man would take one of the large printed sheets, rapidly fold it twice, and pass it to the next man, who performed the next operation. Stitched and collated, then put into a viz and hammered together before being trimmed on with hand saw and glued. Bit by bit, the book would be prepared for the final hardcover. In a press and bindery, Bhaktivedanta Swami would also occasionally travel by bus across the Yamuna River to Mr. Hitsasharan Sharma's Radha Press. The Radha Press was printing 1,000 dust jackets for the volume. Somebody would likes to read?
Are we back again?
Round 2.
Let's see. Okay. And Sharma. Swamiji was going hither and thither. He was getting whatever collections he could and depositing them. And he was always mixing with many persons, going hither and thither. With me, he was very fond that I should do everything as soon as possible. He had a great haste. He used to say, time is going, quick, do it. He would be annoyed with me also, and he would have me do his work first. But I was in the service of Dalmia, and I would tell him, your work has to be secondary for me. But he would say, now you have wasted my 2 days. What is this? Sharmaji, I am coming here. I told you in the morning, and you have not done it even now. But I would reply, I have got no time during the day. Then he would say, then you have wasted. So he was very much pressing me. That was his temperament. The binding was reddish, the color of an earthen brick, and was inlaid with gold lettering. Bhaktivedanta Swami had designed the dust jacket himself, and he had commissioned a young Bengal Salit to execute it. It was a wraparound picture of the entire spiritual and material manifestations. Dominating the front cover was a pink lotus, and within its whorl were Radha and Krishna and their pastimes in Vrindavan, along with Lord Chaitanya chanting and dancing with his associates. From Krishna's lotus planet emanated yellow rays of light, and in that effulgence were many spiritual planets appearing like so many suns. Sitting within each planet was a different four-armed form of Narayan, each with his name lettered beneath the planet. Trivikram, Keshava, Purushottam, and so on. At the bottom of the front cover, Mahavishnu was exhaling the material universes. On the inside, Bhaktivedanta Swami's explanation of the color illustration. When the printing and binding were completed, there were 1,100 copies. Bhaktivedanta Swami would receive 100 copies, and the printer would keep the balance. From the sale of the 100 copies, Bhaktivedanta Swami would continue to pay off his debt to the printer and binder. Then he would receive another. This would continue until he had finished paying his debt. His plan was to then publish a second volume from the profits of the first, and a third volume from the profits of the second. Kant Vedi went to pick up the first 100 copies. He hired a man who put the books in large baskets, placed them on his hand truck, and then hauled them through the streets. But Bhaktivedanta Swami stacked them in his room on a bench. Next.
Bhaktivedanta Swami went to sell his books and present them to important people. Radhakrishnan, who gave him a personal audience, agreed to read the book and write his opinion. Hanuman Prasad Podar was the first to write a favorable review. It is a source of great pleasure for me that a long cherished dream has materialized and is going to be materialized with this, and there would be a publication. I thank the Lord that due to His grace, this publication, Bhaktivedanta Swami went to the major libraries, universities, and schools in Delhi, where the librarian found him calm and quiet, noble, polite, scholarly, a specific glow in him. Traveling on foot, he visited schools, administration office throughout Delhi and placed copies in more than 40 schools in Delhi area. The Minister of Education, which had previously denied his assistance, placed an order for 50 copies for selected university and institutional libraries throughout India. The ministry paid him 600 rupees plus packing and postal charges. And Bhaktivinoda Swami mailed the books to the designated libraries. The US Embassy purchased 18 copies to be distributed in America throughout the Library of Congress. The institutional sales were brisk, but then sales slowed. As the only agent, Bhaktivinoda Swami was now spending hours just to sell a few copies. He was eager to print the second volume, yet until enough money came from the first, he could not print. In the meantime, he continued translating and writing purport. While so many volumes was a huge task that would take many years, and at his present rate, with sales so slow, he would not be able to complete the work in his lifetime. Although there were many who took part in the production of book and still others who became customers, only Bhaktivinoda Swami deeply experienced the success and failures of the venture. It was his project and he was responsible. No one was eager to see him writing prolifically, and no one demanded that it be printed. Even when the sales slowed to be trickle, the manager of OK Press were not distressed. They would give him the balance of his books only when he paid for them. And since it was only he who had the burden of hiring OK Press to print the second volume, the pressure was on him to go out and sell as many copies of the first volume as possible. For Hanuman Prasad Podar, the volume had been something to admire in passing. For Hitcharan Sarma, it has been something he had tended to after his day's work for Mr. Dalmia, for the boy who lived in Chippiwada. The book had meant a few errands. For the paper dealer, it had meant a small order. For Dr. Radhakrishnan, it has been but the slightest, soon forgotten matter in the life crammed with the national policies and Hindu philosophy. But Bhaktivinoda Swami, by his full engagement in producing the Bhagavatam, felt bliss and assurance that Krishna was pleased. He did not, however, intend for Bhagavatam to be his private affair. It was sorely needed medicine for the ill of Kali Yuga, and it was not possible for only one man to administer it. Yet he was alone, and he felt exclusive pleasure and satisfaction in serving his Guru and Lord Krishna. Thus his transcendental frustration and pleasure mingled, his, his will strengthened, and he continued alone. Next, Haribol.
The spiritual master, huh? The spiritual master, previous
Yeah,
spiritual masters,
yeah,
and
some shot, yeah.
huh? And the Vedic scriptures all assured him that he was right. If a person got a copy of the Bhagavatam and read even one page, he might try to take part in order to time his movement. If a person seriously read the book, he would be convinced about spiritual life. The more this book could be distributed, the more the people could understand Krishna consciousness. And if they understood Krishna consciousness, They would become liberated from all problems. Book selling was real preaching. Dr. Siddhartha neglect of constructing temples or he could preach as well as Srimad Bhagavatam. Certainly whoever spent 16 rupees for a book would also take the title. In the months that followed, Bhaktivedanta Swami received more favorable reviews. The prestigious Adyar Library Bulletin gave a full review, noting the editor's vast and deep study of the subject, including further volumes of his publication are eagerly awaited. His scholarly godbrothers also wrote their appreciations. Swami Ban Maharaj, rector of the Institute of Oriental Philosophy in Vrindavan, wrote, I have nothing but admiration for your bold and practical venture. If you should be able to complete the whole work, you will render a very great service to the cause of Prabhupada, Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and the country also. Do it and rest assured there will be no scarcity of resources. Bhakti Saranga Maharaj wrote a full review in his Sajjana Tosani. We expect that this particular English version of Srimad Bhagavatam will be wide. Spiritual poverty of people in general may be removed forever. At a time when we need it very greatly, Swami has given us the right thing. We recommend this publication for everyone's serious study. Sri Vishwanath Das, Governor of Uttar Pradesh, commended the volume to all thoughtful people, and Economic Review praised the author for attempting a tremendous task. At a time when not only the people of India, but those of the West need the quality of love and truth in the corrupting atmosphere of hate and hypocrisy. A work like this will have uplifting and corrective influence. Dr. Zakir Hussain, Vice President of India, wrote, I have read your book, Srimad Bhagavatam, with great interest and much profit. I thank you again for the kind thought which must have prompted you to present it to me. Favorable reviews, although Bhaktivedanta Swami could not pay the printer with them, indicated a serious response. The book was valuable, and subsequent volumes would earn the series even more respect. By Krishna's grace, Bhaktivedanta Swami had already completed many of the translations and purports for Volume 2. Even in the last weeks of printing the first volume, he had been writing day and night for the second volume. It was glorification of the Supreme Lord, Krishna, and therefore it would require many, many volumes. He felt impelled to praise Krishna and describe him in more and more volumes. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had said that the presses of the world could not print fast enough the glories of Krishna and the spiritual world that are being received at every moment by pure devotees. All right? So we keep going. So I keep going.
Maybe yeah, just want to finish off that would be great. Just the pages, whatever.
Okay. Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to return several months of intensive writing on the temple. Vrindavan was the best place for writing transcendental literature that had already been demonstrated by the Vaishnava acharyas of the past. Living in simple ease, taking little rest and food, he continually translated the verses and composed his Bhaktivedanta purports for Volume 2. And a few months after amassing enough manuscript pages, he would return to Delhi and once again enter the world of publishing. In Volume 1, he had covered the first 6.5 chapters of the first canto. The second volume began on page 365 with the 8th verse of the 7th chapter. Bhaktivedanta Swami wrote in his purport that Srimad Bhagavatam was meant for Paramahamsas, persons engaged purely in self-realization. Yet, he wrote, It works into the depth of the heart of those who may be worldly, all engaged in the matter of sense gratification. Even such men also will find in this Vedic literature a remedial measure for their material diseases. Bhaktivedanta Swami returned to Delhi to raise funds for printing Volume 2. When he visited a prospective donor, he would show the man Volume 1 and the growing collection of reviews, explaining that he was asking a donation not to support himself, but to print this important literature. Although, for the first volume, he had received no donations equal to the 4,000 rupees he received from Mr. Potter, an executive in the L&H sugar factory gave a donation of 5,000 rupees for Volume 2. Thanks. Bhaktivedanta Swami had been dissatisfied with Hitsaran Sharma as a production supervisor. Although supposedly an expert in the trade, Hitsaran had caused delays, and sometimes he had advised Gautam Sharma without consulting Bhaktivedanta Swami. The work of Volume 1 had slowed and even stopped when a job from a cash customer had come up, and Bhaktivedanta Swami had complained that it was Hitsaran's fault for not giving money to OK Press on time. For Volume 2, Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to deal directly with OK Press and supervise the printing himself. He spoke to Gautam Sharma and offered a partial payment. Although the majority of the copies of Volume 1 were still standing on their printing floor, Bhaktivedanta Swami wanted OK Press to begin Volume 2. Gautam Sharma accepted the job. It was early in 1964 when Volume 2 went to press, following the same steps as Volume 1. This time, Bhaktivedanta Swami was more actively pushing. To avoid delays, he purchased the paper himself. Sidho Mal and Sons Paper Merchants, in the heart of Paper District, he would choose and order his paper and then arrange to transport it to OK Press. The other was a large one, he would have it carried by cart. Small orders he would send by rickshaw or on the head of a bearer.
In his preface to the second volume, Bhaktivedanta Swami expressed the apparent oddity of working in Delhi while living in Vrindavan. The path of fruitive activities, that is to say, the path of earn money and enjoy life, as it is going on generally, appears to have become also our profession, although we have renounced the order of worldly life. They see that we are moving in the cities, in the government offices, banks, and other business places for promoting the publication of Srimad Bhagavatam. They also see that we are moving in the press, paper, market, and amongst the bookbinders also away from our residence at Vrindavan, and thus they conclude sometimes mistakenly that we are also doing the same business in the dress of a mendicant. But actually, there is a gulf of difference between the two kinds of activities. This is not a business for maintaining an establishment of material enjoyment. On the contrary, it is a to broadcast the glories of the Lord at a time when the people need it very badly. He went on to describe how, in former days, even 50 years ago, well-to-do members of society had commissioned and write their Bhagavatam and then distribute copies amongst the devotees and the general people. But times had changed. At the present moment, the time is so changed that we had to request one of the biggest industrialists of India to purchase 100 copies and distribute them, but the poor fellow expressed his that somebody may come forward to pay for the actual cost of publication of his Srimad Bhagavatam and let them be distributed free to all the leading gentlemen of the world. But nobody is so far prepared to do this social uplifting work. Thanking the Ministry of Education and the Director of Education for distributing copies to institutions and libraries, Bhaktivedanta Swami again stated his reading public. The problem is that we must get some money for completing the book, which is admittedly a mighty project. The sales proceeds of being employed in the promotional work and not in sense gratification. Herein lies the difference from the fruitive activities. And for all this, we have to approach everyone concerned just like a businessman. There is no harm to become a businessman if it is done on account of the Lord. Harm to become a violent warrior like Arjuna or Hanumanji if such belligerent activities are executed to satisfy the desires of the Supreme Lord. Someone else?
I think we're nearly finished the section there. So there's just one more paragraph.
Okay. So even though we are not in the Himalayas, even though we talk of business, even though we deal in rupees and paisa, still, simply because we are 100% servants of the Lord and are engaged in the service of broadcasting the message of His glories, certainly we shall transcend and get through the invincible impasse of Maya and reach the effulgent kingdom of God to render Him face-to-face eternal service in full bliss and knowledge. We are confident of this factual position, and we may also assure to our numerous readers that they will also achieve the same result on receipt of the first copies of the second volume, another 400-page cloth-bound, brick-colored Srimad Bhagavatam, with the same dust jacket as Volume 1. Bhaktivedanta Swami made the rounds, scholars, politicians, and booksellers. One Delhi bookseller, Dr. Manohar Lal Jain, had particular success in selling the volumes. Manohar Lal Jain. He would come to me for selling his books. He would come often, and he used to chat with me for 1 or 2 hours. He had no other business except selling his books as much as possible. We would discuss the difficulties he was having, and also many other things, yoga, Vedanta, and religious aspects of life. His problem was distributing his work because it was a big publication. He had planned to publish it in many volumes. Naturally, I told him it was not possible for any individual bookseller or publisher here to publish it and invest money in it. So that was a little bit of a disappointment for him because he could not bring out more volumes. But my sales were good because this was the best translation. Sanskrit text with English translations. No other such edition was available. I sold about 150 to 200 copies in about 2 or 3 years. The price was very little, only 16 rupees. He had published his reviews and he had a good sell, a good market. The price was reasonable and he was not interested in making money out of it. He was printing in English for the foreigners. He had a good command of Sanskrit as well as English. When we met, we would speak in English, and his English was very impressive. Is there still a lot to go, Manu Prabhu?
No, there's just there's 2 more paragraphs there.
Okay,
yeah.
Should I finish it? Okay.
Yeah.
He wanted me to publish, but I didn't have any presses and no finances. I told him frankly I would not be able to publish it, because it was not 1 or 2 volumes, but many. But he managed, anyhow. I referred to him to Atmaram and Sons. He also used to go there. He was a great master, a philosopher, a great scholar. I used to enjoy the talks. He used to sit with me for 1 or 2 hours, as much as he could afford. Sometimes he would come in the morning, 11 or 12, and then sometimes in the afternoon. He used to come in for money. How many copies are sold? So I would pay him. Practically, he was not doing very well with finances at that time. He only wanted that his books should be sold to every library, everywhere where the people are interested in it. We used to publish a catalog every month, and I would advertise his book. Orders would be coming from all over the world. So at least for me, the sales were picking up. If I sold 100 copies of the first volume, then I figured the second volume would be sold in the same number, naturally. But definitely those who would take the first volume would also take volume 2, because it was institutional, and the institutions will always try to complete their set. He used to discuss with me how the volumes can be brought out, and how many it would take to complete the Srimad Bhagavatam. He was very much interested in bringing out the whole series. Do you want to continue, Srila?
Okay. In January of the Swami was granted an interview with Indian Vice President Zakir Hussain, who, although a Muslim, had written an appreciation of Bhaktivedanta Swami Srimad Bhagavatam, Dr. Hussain cordially received the author at the presidential palace. Bhaktivedanta Swami spoke of the importance of Srimad Bhagavatam in the cause of love of Godhead. But Dr. Hussain wanted to know how love of Godhead could help humanity. The question put by ruler to Sadhu was filled with philosophical implications, but the vice president's busy schedule of meetings did not permit Bhaktivedanta Swami to answer fully. For the vice president, the interview was a gesture of appreciation, recognizing the Swami for his work on behalf of India's Hindu cultural heritage, and Bhaktivedanta Swami humbly accepted the ritual. Wrote Dr. Hussain a long letter answering the question he had not had time to answer during their brief meeting. Muslims also admit. He wrote that there's nothing greater than Allah. The Christians also admit that God is great. The human society must learn to obey the laws of God. He reminded Dr. Hussain of India's great cultural asset, the Vedic literature. The Indian government could perform the best welfare work for humanity by disseminating Vedic knowledge in a systematic way. Srimad Bhagavatam was produced in India. It was the substantial contribution India could offer to the world. Jai.
Jai.
Hare Krishna. Very well.
Jai. I have to leave now because I have to attend the Kirtan for the Mataji. So see you on Thursday. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.